course, the Patreon, if you want to be deified, you already know all you have to do is join the Patreon. Only a god can deify another person to become a god. So listen, you want to become a god, consider helping the man out. That's all I could say. He is a man god, by the way. So with that being said, let's talk about Paul. But before we actually get into Paul, I wanted to allow you two gentlemen to maybe tell us, how can we understand Paul? He's been orthodoxed, if I could use the term, if that's even an accurate term. He has been painted in a certain way by tradition. But when I read your book earlier, Paul and Jesus, right, listening to it in Audible, reading your book, Becoming Divine, Dr. Litwa, Paul's Ascent to Paradise, Dr. Tabor, what is going on with this person we call Paul?
I'll let James go first.
Well, yeah, I focus quite a bit on Paul. God, I don't want to name the years. It's too many decades. But I studied at the University of Chicago in the 70s. So at least I'll date myself there a little bit. With Jonathan Z. Smith, whom David and I both consider just the master of masters, the wizard of Hellenistic religions. And he would want to say that if you approach Paul, back off quite a bit and talk about the ancient Mediterranean world. And the reason my work intersects so well with David's work, just look at the titles of his books, not his book, many books. Mediterranean myths, Mediterranean thought. And that's really the high-end training at the PhD level now that people get. That is, you don't just microscopically work on a couple chapters of the New Testament all your life, but you try to back off and understand the world of Paul. And I don't mean just the political, social world. Usually when you talk about the world of Paul, I think people think, oh, you mean like he was maybe a Roman citizen, maybe not, according to Acts, but he never mentions it. And you kind of do this bio-sociological thing with Paul, and that's all valid. But to me, it's Paul the myth maker, Paul the mystical ascender to heaven, the one who heard and saw things unutterable. And that's what the book is, Paul's Ascent to Paradise, this is a version of my dissertation that I did years ago. But the reason I mentioned Jonathan Z. Smith, Google him, he's amazing. He died a few years ago. But I was the first student to work on a New Testament text with him, or a New Testament subject rather. And he insisted, like, yeah, you're doing New Testament, but you could have just as well chosen Lucian, the satirist of the Roman world, or you could talk about the Mithras liturgy, which is part of the great, Paris magical papyri, or you could do Poimandres, that's from the Corpus Hermetica. His idea was, let's talk about ways of being religious in the Hellenistic period and not segregate this one character off in that way. But at this point, all I would want to say is we're just going to take a wide view. We really agree on this. And we want to ask, what is salvation for Paul? Because for Paul, salvation is not just judicial, like, oh, my sins are forgiven. That's the way it's usually seen today. Salvation is, how are you going to live trapped in this lower cosmos with all the angels and principalities bearing down upon you? And how are you ever going to be able to ascend out of this and join the ultimate God who is beyond all gods and so forth? And so we want to contextualize him in that broad theological, you could call it theology, probably I should just say conceptual, mythological way, often called the mysticism of Paul. I love Schweitzer's book. I dedicated my dissertation to Schweitzer and both of my Paul book, because everybody knows, in English at least, Quest of the Historical Jesus. But who knows that wonderful book, The Mysticism of Paul the Apostle? And we didn't even have the Dead Sea Scrolls. But he said, if you want to understand Paul, yeah, your sins are forgiven. Yeah, the blood of Christ, Romans 3 and so forth. But how about Romans 8? What's wrong with the cosmos?
Mm-hmm.
And what's wrong with your body, your mortal body, so that the good that you would, you do not, and the evil that you would not, that you do? What's going on there? So that's what I would say as an introduction to that. We want to put Paul in his conceptual world. And if you do that, the inside is just like a spotlight. You finally understand, because Paul has been Lutheranized and Catholicized. And what was your verb you created? Orthodoxized?
Orthodoxied.
Yeah, he's been orthodoxy. And, if you ask him, he would go, no, I'm just like a stranger in a strange land who's trying to get back to God, because the creation, Satan's the God of the world. He says that, Galatians 4:4. I can quote the scriptures like football signals because I was raised evangelical, just like you, Derek. So, I can just spin those things out, So Satan's the God of this world, and the principalities and powers are bearing down. So that would be my way of starting. We're going to talk about ascent to heaven and deification, but we need to look at salvation as like Smith would always say, it's like getting away and escaping from the world of sin, the flesh, and from death. But it's a Hebraized view of it because he is Jewish, in his concepts. So. So, David, sorry to go so long there, but jump in. And
no, that's fine. I think for your viewers, it's really important to understand the politics of Pauline interpretation. Very first of all, Paul has been protected. Reading Paul within the Orthodox tradition protects Paul in many ways from the Greco-Roman world. And those who are opponents of the Greco-Roman world still dismiss it today as pagan, which always has carried a negative edge and has always been used in Christian apologetics to say, this is the stuff that's bad. So if Paul is put in touch, Paul is the genius of Christianity as usually taken, but if Paul is put in touch with all this pagan stuff, then all of a sudden Christianity is in danger. So the politics of it is to protect Paul with Judaism, or more properly speaking, our modern constructions of Judaism as something already somehow, some way, not hermetically sealed off, but in some way protected from the larger Greco-Roman world. And part of this is, the major context for understanding Paul among the Orthodox tradition is simply to look at the Old Testament. And this is a highly political way of doing it because, there have been countless and countless studies and books on Paul and of finding the Old Testament in the New. And why is that? Because it protects Paul. Reading Paul in light of the Christian Old Testament makes Paul already seem like he is isolated from the larger streams of Greco-Roman thinking. And that just is not true. There was in the late 19th and early 20th century a very important school in Germany called the Religionsgeschichtliche Schule. And in this school, they emphasized not only to look at Paul in terms of religious practice, but also to look at Paul in terms of the Greco-Roman environment and all aspects of that environment, not just the high elite writers like Cicero, but also things like the Greek magical papyri and the Hermetic authors mentioned by James, Gnostic Mandaean texts, and simply Greco-Roman mythology. All this was fair game. And then in the mid-20th century, there was this enormous backlash against, in neo-Orthodoxy, there was an enormous backlash against viewing Paul in this way, in this context. And ever since then, things have gotten so varied right now, we can't tell one continuous narrative. But ever since then, there has been always, even today, a strong emphasis on protecting Paul. Now, just to clarify, I don't have any problem at all viewing Paul within a so-called Jewish context or Judaism or Judaisms. But the thing to keep in mind here, folks, is that Judaism is itself just another Hellenic religion. At least that's how I'm theorizing and viewing it. It isn't an exception. And we can't submit to a kind of Christian exceptionalism, which then, you know, Christians have invented the Judeo-Christian tradition. The Jews don't, you know, didn't invent that. The Christians invented that. So they take Judaism and their reconstruction of Judaism as a partner, and they say that this is the buffer that can protect Paul and Jesus, by the way, from the Greco-Roman world. And that model of understanding is an apologetic model that goes back thousands of years and must be resisted at all costs.
One, Paul echoes Jewish apocalypticism in 1 Corinthians 2, 6-13, namely the revelation given to Enoch by the angel Uriel. Could he also be drawing from Hecalot treatises for these wisdom and cosmology traditions?
Okay, I'll take a stab at that.
Sure.
In the book, the new book, Paul's Ascent to Paradise, I do talk about Hecalot, Rabbati, and other kinds of mystical traditions within Judaism. But just as David said, those have to also be not hermetically sealed off. Many of them are later, but we find within Mishnaic stories that we think go back to the 1st and 2nd century CE, the 4 rabbis who ascend to paradise and how you take that and what happens to them and so forth. So yes, absolutely. That material is in the air. But you know, you've read a bit of my book, Derek. You said you're still working through it. But Poimandres and the Mithras liturgy are not that different from Hecalot Rabbati. And I've just crossed about 3 different cultures here because the contextual obstacles that you have to, quote, overcome to be saved are very, very similar. The agents are different, of course, and some of the other things. I wanted to tell David, though, I couldn't help remembering my fear and trembling. I was 27 years old. I arrived at the University of Chicago, and I had a master's degree from Pepperdine University in Bible. And Pepperdine's a decent place, and I studied with good people there. I majored in classics in college, and I met with Jonathan Smith. I wanted to study with him. And he said, have you read Richard Reitzenstein? And David knows exactly what I'm talking about. Now, there is an English translation, but he meant like auf Deutsch bitte. Like, have you read Hellenistische Mysterien Religionen? And I said, no. Now, guess what? I'd never even heard of Reitzenstein. Not that I hadn't read it. And then he started naming a bunch of other writers. I had heard of A.D. Nock, thank God, who's the greatest of the great in a Harvard guy. I could tell you Nock stories all day. I didn't study with him, but I didn't know Morton Smith. I didn't know any of these people. So I was just such a babe in the woods. What did I know? I knew the New Testament really well, and I knew the Greek, and I knew, you know, kind of standard theological interpretations. So my world just exploded, because the first course I took was called Hellenistic Religions. And Jonathan started with an ancient Near Eastern story called the Pickaxe. It's Egyptian. No, it's not. It's Akkadian. And I thought, why are you beginning there? Eventually, I began to figure out what he was doing. He's trying to show you how in the ancient Near East, the world of the Hebrew Bible, things are in place. Things are settled. The cosmos makes sense. Remember, Rahab has been chopped up into pieces. The sea's not going to come in and flood. And he wanted to set the stage for the disruption that began to take place in the Hellenistic world following Alexander. And I'm not just attributing it to Alexander, but this sense of feeling alienation. It's actually kind of akin to modern existentialism, although it rests upon different pillars. But it's this idea of basically strangers in a strange land. You know, how did we get here? From whence have we fallen? Where are we headed? What is behind? What is ahead? The mysteries of the cosmos, the things that you've delved into, Derek. This is just part and parcel of the Hellenistic world. Now, the Platonists, many of your listeners, I'm sure, and viewers have maybe dabbled with Plato and the Timaeus, but the Timaeus is simply another version of this whole tale of alienation. So Paul is really telling you, it's not just like, how do I get saved by the blood of Christ? The way Christians today would probably define, Paul's teaching. Like, you're a sinner and Christ died for your sins. And if you turn to Christ, he'll forgive you. And when you die, you'll go to heaven. That is so far from Paul. Paul wants to see the cosmos saved. You understand? The physical creation, he says, is groaning in travail until it's birth into what it's supposed to be. It's like an embryo, Romans 8. And then he talks about individuals that follow Christ are going to become the firstborn of this new family of cosmic beings. The real question is, you're immortal, you're going to die, you're in the flesh, the universe is dying. This is a mortal world, and we're down at the lowest level, you understand? The earth is the lowest level of the cosmos. There's 7 levels above, and then even the ultimate 8th beyond that. That's the problem. And Sanders said this, he calls it the judicial idea of Christianity. It's a court scene. You've got sins. You've been called up to the judge's bench. You're going to get declared guilty or not guilty and sentenced. And then it's viewed like that. And you go, oh, thank God I got a pardon. I get to go free. Well, that's not really what Paul is about. Let's see you ascend to heaven 1 foot. Jump in the air and you're going to come right back down on the earth. So Paul is about, how is this created world subject to futility by God? It's kind of a mock-up of a future possible new creation. And he's taking Hebrew Bible concepts like the creation of the new heavens and new earth and so forth, but he's applying them within this Hellenistic matrix. And we can go into all kinds of other texts, and we'll get into his ascent to paradise. But David and I totally agree on this broader context.
Yeah.
And, usually, go to the SBL, Study Biblical Literature. David and I go all the time. Half the papers on Paul are going to be like sacred meals in 1 Corinthians 11, which is fine. We need to know the Hellenistic background and things like that. But very seldom would you have a paper on Paul's cosmos and how to negotiate your way within it. Because you realize these powers can zap you really badly. The guy living with his father's wife in 1 Corinthians 5, he's kicked out. But did you notice Paul says, when you're assembled together in the name of the Lord Jesus, and his spirit is present. And then he goes, and my spirit is present. What's he projecting, his spirit into the little house church at Corinth? He goes, deliver this guy to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, that his spirit can be saved in the day of the Lord. What? Let's talk about that a little bit. No, because if you get kicked out of the little circle of the protected ones, the God of this world, that is Satan, the principalities and powers, boy, they're going to have their way with you. It's a very scary thing.
Just real quick, I've always appreciated Doc Pleromena. You're always on the money, and so comparing the Hekalo as a comparandum is good, but chronologically, the Hekalo, like most rabbinic literature, is going to be a late antique literature, which means it's going to be several hundred years beyond Paul. But Enoch is really, really important, and I would say for most late 1st and 2nd century Christians, Enoch is scripture, by which I mean First Enoch, and we see that in Jude, which the only scripture that it quotes is Enoch. Okay, so we know that it's extremely important, and we know that Enoch's ascent to heaven forms a kind of model, not only for later renditions of Jesus's ascent to heaven, but for Paul himself. So Paul, even though he doesn't really mention Enoch, those Enochic traditions, which are 100 years before Paul, had really seeped into the cultural bedrock. And that is absolutely key for comparing Paul's own experience. The myth of Enoch had formed the mysticism of Paul.
And he has a question. He's specifically addressing someone. This is when you brought up the 7 levels of heaven, right, with Paul. So there's a Christian apologist who is criticizing Islam. His name's Jay Smith. And he's criticizing Islam about the 7 or 6 heavens and earths. Why does his Bible say that St. Paul went to heaven? And where does the idea of numbering of the heavens come from? So it's almost like, let me try and phrase the question in another way, because I know that there's a language barrier there. The Christian is criticizing the Muslim about the 7 heavens and the 7 earths. Does he have ground to stand on, or does not Paul believe in something like this? Is there something to it? I don't know. Where's this tradition? Do you have any idea? Because I know Islam is not your forte, but
I don't know much about the Islamic side of it, but of course the Greek Hellenistic side would correlate with the 7 planetary spheres, and the sun and moon are included in that. And the idea, this is just as scientific to the ancient Hellenist as our Copernican universe is to us, that the earth goes around the sun and so forth. It's just a fact. So it wouldn't surprise me but I'm not sure if that's what Muhammad or the Quran or whatever text it is referring to, that you would have that number 7. Maybe they're associated with the planetary spheres, but these are levels. Paul usually doesn't use that term, but he uses heights, depths. Depths are under the earth, the world of the dead, the chthonic deities. Heights are all the way up. And then principalities and powers. At the end of Romans 8, remember, he ticks them all off. And the idea is that Jesus has conquered all of these spheres and been immortalized or deified. And I want to be sure we get into Philippians 2 later. I don't want to do it now. But I don't even think it's about a pre-existent Jesus, but we can talk about that.
Talk about it. What do you think about it?
But I'm not sure whether I don't know. David, do you know more about the idea of 7 earths and 7 heavens in Islamic tradition to help address that question?
Not in Islam, but one thing I would point out in giving the context of this is that Jews, Christians, and other Hellenic peoples in the Greco-Roman world, they believed in multi-layered heavens, but typically they couldn't agree. So for instance, in Paul's case, he says he goes to the 3rd heaven and enters paradise. Does that mean that paradise is the top level, in which case there would be 3 levels of heaven? What about 7 levels? The Ascension of Isaiah in the early 2nd century has exactly 7 levels of heaven. But then when you turn over to 2nd Enoch, which scholars have hypothesized was written in late 1st century Alexandria, all of a sudden we have 10 heavens. And when you turn to the letter of Eugnostus, which is in Nag Hammadi, then you've got 360. And Irenaeus says that Basilides had 365 heavens for the obvious reason of representing the days of the year. So this is something that's really intriguing, that early people in antiquity, they certainly agreed in a multi-level heaven, but they wrangled about how many layers there were. And the reason I think this is significant is because there's in a sense tremendous agreement that there are real cosmic spaces up there, and they're not different dimensions. That is, there you don't go into like a 5th dimension. They are real cosmic spaces, and they did, I think it's fair to say, think that if you had a means of taking some kind of a spaceship, that you could go up and ascend to those levels, because Lucian makes fun of this in his book, True Histories.
Are you familiar with Lucian, Derek? Are you familiar?
Yes, he's the one who does the comedy on.
Yeah.
Isn't he cracking jokes on Christians the
He's
whole
the
time?
only ancient writer in this genre, at least, that I can be sitting alone, nobody around, reading my Loeb classic. I just break out with a belly laugh that's just obscene, because he's so funny. So I just wondered if you had delved into that. Yeah.
I have not read it for myself, but I know of.
But
Lucian.
yeah, David obviously is correct. And in my book, Paul's Ascent to Paradise, I try to meticulously go through many of the major traditions. I don't get into the Nag Hammadi later, but so-called First Enoch, Second Enoch, Ascension of Isaiah, and so forth. And yeah, you've got this variation, and it is hard to tell. I kind of skirt the question in my book, because as David said, is he enters paradise. That's the main thing. But then paradise is the world of the dead in some of these traditions, where the souls of the righteous are waiting. And in older traditions, they're down below the earth, and the dead in Christ rise up, to meet the Lord in the air, by the way. And the air is the lower atmosphere, I guess we would call it, but it's not a very safe place, because there's just tons of devils and demons and spirits running around, good and bad. Remember Frank Cross said years ago, and it was really bad of him to say, because he used a cat as an example. And I happen to love dogs and cats, but he said, you couldn't even swing a cat by its tail in the ancient world without knocking out 10 or 20 spirit beings. But he's just making the point that it's a different world. It's a world that maybe Pentecostal Christians and people that know that tradition, like if your car won't start after church, there's a reason.
Yeah, Satan's trying to stop you.
Or and Paul says he's going to make a trip, and he goes, I planned to come to you once, twice, but Satan hindered me. Now that could have been he went down to the dock and he planned to take a certain ship, and they go, well, that's full, we can't take anybody else. Satan had some extra people join. I mean, this is the world that he's in. It's I would call it a mystical, magical world. I know the word magic for some people is a problem, because the old dichotomy, what David was talking about, the hermetically sealed dichotomy, was there's religion, which is devotion. That's the real stuff, like true religion, faith, Old Testament, New Testament, Hebrew Bible. And then there's the pagan stuff, that's magic. You see, and as Morton Smith said, one person's religion is another person's magic. And Durkheim said there's no church of magic. So magic is really a way of referring to what your enemies do. Mm-hmm. If Jesus is spitting on the ground and making mud and touching eyes and saying Ephrata and stuff like that, that's not magic. That's like religious healing, you see. But if Asclepius does it, or if Apollonius of Tyana does it, like, look at that pagan, he's using magic. And you say, well, spells, that's magic. Are you kidding me? You don't think Paul curses people from a distance? 1 Corinthians 5, the guy living with his father's wife, to deliver him to Satan is putting a magical curse on him. If you don't like the word magic, a spiritual curse. In other words, the whole point is, and then the other thing is, magic requires paraphernalia. It's like a little trick box, and you pull out, little, maybe a feather and some bat blood and, this kind of stuff. That's magic. And religion is just piously sitting and worshiping God, and, that's okay. But what you find in like Poimandres and especially Poimandres, which is the Hermetic text of the revelation of Ascent to Heaven I cover in the book, there's no paraphernalia whatsoever. You literally kind of go like this and go into a kind of meditation, and you begin to go up, but you got to know what you're doing. in which you have, the only indication we have in the Golden Ass or Metamorphoses, Apuleius, as to what happened even in the Osiris religion. Remember, is you go to the world below and the world above, and you greet all the gods face to face. And we've got these golden plates. Do you know about the golden plates? The little, they're probably, I don't mean Mormon, golden foil. They're these 17 inscriptions that have been found. It'd be like rolling up a little gold foil and you put it by the ear of the deceased in a tomb. There are probably thousands of them, but 17 have been found. And basically it's telling you how to negotiate the world. It's the world below because it's 3rd century BC, but it's the same idea. And it says that you show some spunk with these forces. Like if you're a Christian, I picture you would say, I'm going up and I declare in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, who rules all the spheres of the cosmos, let me by. And then they let you by. You see, it's that kind of thing that we get in the text. So it's actually.
Let me poke in here. Let me poke in here.
Yeah,
real
go
quick.
ahead.
I got to ask you something because this is really. I love everything that you're saying, and I want to do this again. I hope both of you gentlemen will. I have to ask, as we're going off into some really good territory, but your book today, I was reading Paul and Jesus, and of course, Dr. Litwitz mentioned this, that Paul says that the law was given by angels. These angels are the same ones that you're describing. You have to kind of negotiate with. Jesus rules the cosmos, and he, in the name of Jesus, and you're telling these angels. But Paul also says that one day they would judge these angels or judge the angels. What's going on with Paul saying the law was delivered by angels? That seems highly suspicious to me from what I've heard from you, Dr. Litwa, you, Dr. Tabor. I've heard it from Dr. Price, others who are kind of looking outside of the box and not in the sanitized, Orthodox, Lutheran, whatever you want to call it, Catholicizing box. Why is the law given by angels? Isn't that kind of a slam in a way? What's going on there?
It's certain. Oh, David, you go ahead. I talked quite a bit before, but I'll talk. I'll add something to what you say, and we probably agree on it. So,
well, so it deals with a larger question of Paul and later Gnostic Christian traditions, I think. And what's important to recognize is, although in the early 20th century there was a move to make Paul into a Gnostic or make Paul the first Gnostic, that's a bit of an overstatement. But I think what's important to recognize is that Paul has a very similar cosmology as what, say, later 2nd century Christians who called themselves Gnostics, which just means knowers. Okay, they're spiritual knowers. They are endowed with spiritual knowledge. They have a cosmology where on the lower levels, okay, they disagree on how many levels, but on the lower levels, they all agree that there is a war going on, and it's between spirits. And when we say spirits in the modern world, we may think of totally invisible and incorporeal beings. But I think Paul and later philosophers like Porphyry, I think they were quite concrete and said that these beings are made out of some kind of substance, which was something like air or refined air, and that that they actually breathed in the smoke of the sacrifices, and that their bodies kind of looked a bit smoky. But they were normally just invisible, meaning that they were clear or diaphanous, but they were entirely material beings. And that's important, I think, to recognize.
Almost like if you're walking on a road and it's hot and you see the mirage of the mirage of steam or whatever you'd like to say, heat coming off the road, that looks like that would be a spirit in a way to them, I suspect, right?
Exactly. Yeah, they believed in ether or ether, if you prefer, and so some of these beings, and ether just means that very high refined air up in the stratosphere, and that's what these beings were made out of. So They were invisible, and they could do things like give laws to people. Now, I think, and this is a passage not very well known, but in the letter to Barnabas, okay, Barnabas 9, verse 4, I would urge everyone to go find this. It's in a collection called the Apostolic Fathers, but that just means it's in early Christian letters. Barnabas is a pseudonym. The writer of this letter says that an evil angel, and that his Greek here is angelos poniros, an evil or wicked angel, gave the Jews physical circumcision in order to deceive them. Okay, to play, literally the Greek there is he played the sophist with them. These angels tricked the Jews. And so on some level, when you go back to Galatians 13 or Galatians 3:19, you ask, is that really what Paul is saying? Because that's, I think, what Barnabas thinks Paul is saying, that there are actually angels who are bad, who tricked the Jews at Sinai into thinking that many of the laws supposedly given by God were actually transmitted through channels of these lower rulers who had evil intentions to trick the Jews into obeying weird physical laws like resting every Saturday in a sort of, and to hold on to these laws like not eating pork in a very superstitious way, and that this was actually not the will of God. Because, of course, we learn from Paul himself that God doesn't desire circumcision anyway, physically. And so this is something in terms of the reception of Paul that really has to be kept in mind. I think that could be very well what Paul was saying.
I think Dr. Tabor might agree in some way. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Yeah, well, let me jump in. I do agree in some way. Now, it could be simply the idea of secondary or intermediaries, meaning not direct enough. God has to, just all the way back to sort of a Platonic idea that the unnamed, nameless one has to have a logos or a way of operating. But I tend to go with David because not only do you have Galatians 3, but keep reading Galatians 4. And you have the stoicheia to cosmo. Now, it was translated, what, in the King James, something like elements of the world. And everybody's like, I don't know what that is. But we're pretty sure it's elemental spirits of the cosmos. And remember, he also talks about the form of the cosmos is passing away in 1 Corinthians 7. So these are beings that we usually say tutelatory beings that I wouldn't want to make them satanic with a capital S, but he does name, he says, you observe days, seasons, months, and years, and you were free from all that. And he uses the word we, like once we were under the tutelage of these beings, but now we're free. He's not just talking about some abstract thing like, oh, my sins were forgiven. He is talking about, and it also comes up in a secondary letter even more directly, Colossians 2, 16 and 17, in which he says these touch not, taste not, handle not, regulations that all have to do with regulating the flesh, you see. So he definitely is leaning in that direction. And yet I think he thinks certainly the 10 words, as they're called, were given, by God, even if it was through an intermediator. But isn't it interesting? He says the Torah was added because of transgressions until the seed would come, as if you've got this sort of fundamental, moral way from Abraham to Moses. But then Abraham wasn't living according to all of these things necessarily, you see, as he wasn't a Jew with the full 613 laws of the Torah in operation. But Paul was, and I'm, of course, using that number in terms of the way modern Orthodox count the commandments, but half of which have to do with the temple. But the temple was standing when Paul wrote. And so I think I lean toward what David's saying, that it's it's not, I don't think it's full-blown Gnosticism with a capital G, like an evil, wicked force gave these things, but that because of the sinfulness of the Jewish people, here's Barnabas again, God just said, you're worshiping the golden calf while I'm giving the 10 words to Moses. And I come down and you're reveling and having a wild sex party and getting drunk. And Paul mentions that. This is not just me going back to Exodus. 1 Corinthians 10, he mentions it. He talks about our fathers who passed through the sea and they ate and drank the spiritual food. But then God was not pleased with them. So it's almost like God gave them over to, what he says in Romans 1 about the, quote, pagans who go into all kinds of sin. That's a principle of his that God finally just says, okay, just go with it, because unless you change, you're just headed for damnation. And you almost get the idea, I wouldn't go so far as damnation, but like you ancient Israelites, you are so far from really seeing the light of Christ, and remember, he says the rock that followed them was Christ. This is Paul. So some sort of Christ spirit is manifested back then, but that's not what the law as Paul now understands it. And as his opponents are trying to enforce on his free believers in Christ, I think there is something cosmic going on.
If I might add just one caveat as we get into the next super chat, I'll go ahead and bring it up so I can ask it once I make this point. In Dr. Tabor's book, he brings up that situation in Acts where you have James confronting Paul, and he's saying to him, like, look, now we know, Paul, something like this. We know that you weren't telling Jews to stop circumcising, were you? Like, and Paul never says anything. Acts just has James talk, but Paul does the ritual and like, hey, we're on the same, we're good, right? I paid, all right, we're good. But is this not harmonization? And is this not a voice, right? A voice that's at least saying someone is thinking Paul's telling Jews, hey, not even you need to keep this thing anymore. So we need to cut it all out, I guess, because it's become a stumbling block to following Christ.
It's past, more than that, it's obsolete in passing. Now that the seed has come, you're no longer under these tutelatory powers. It's passing away. Why would you buy into a system that is essentially either obsolete or becoming obsolete? And does he anticipate some sort of destruction of the temple and that sort of thing in his apocalyptic imagination? All we have to go on is 2 Thessalonians, which most scholars don't think is absolutely verse by verse from the hand of Paul. But he does talk about a man of sin sitting in the temple of God. It's going to get destroyed and so forth. So it could be that he's expecting a final roundup of things at the end of the age and maybe expects to live to see it. Remember, Caligula already tried to put his statue in the temple in 41, right? According to some of the records that we have. Nero's not exactly a real stable guy, right? When he's writing a lot of his letters. And so maybe he's anticipating, but he thinks it's all passing away. It's obsolete. I mean, I would take it. And he thinks these powers have been defeated. If they did have some function from Moses to Christ, as he calls it, that parenthetical period when you're under these forces, you're not under them anymore. So why would you go back and put yourself under slavery to the stoicheia tu cosmou, these elemental spirits of the universe that David was describing? You're above those. You don't have to within the fold of the community, the yakad, rather call it the yakad than the church, the group, the together group. You're protected. And Qumran has the same thing. They think they're protected. They think the angels are watching over them, the good angels, and you don't want to be outside of that arena.
Okay, Doc Pluralmanat, the super chat. Many passages attest to a physical resurrection, But what of the ascension? Has the teaching of the bodily ascension been merely assumed? 2 Corinthians 5, I think, sheds light as the body being reclothed. David, would you start us?
Sure. Yeah, I tend to think that most Christians of the late first century more or less thought that the resurrection and ascension were the same thing. If you read Paul, his meeting the Lord in the air in 1 Thessalonians, I think that's basically, he's talking about the resurrection, or the mass resurrection, or the general resurrection, which happens when Jesus returns. But that's also obviously an ascension. I mean, you're being resurrected into the air. And Jesus has attributed final words on the cross to the thief. Today you'll be with me in paradise, indicates that that's a fairly instant rise. And whenever you go to heaven, I think that's a very physical thing. You have to get some sort of physical body. The ancients thought that, the higher you go, you need a suit, as it were, or a kind of body that fits the ecology, that is the celestial ecology. Just as if I were to go to Mars right now, I couldn't survive in this particular body. I would need to have some sort of spacesuit. I would need to be clothed with some sort of spacesuit that enabled me to survive in the Mars environment. And that's very concretely how they thought about rising to heaven. So your resurrection to heaven, it requires you to go to a different ecology, and it requires a different form of body. And the analogies that Paul uses about being clothed, he says, right now our body's like a tent, but in 2 Corinthians 5, our body will be like a temple. It'll be much more permanent and stable. I think it will still be quite material, but it'll be made out of something like photonic energy. Sort of like, I mean, he never exactly says what the soma pneumaticon, or the spirit body, is made out of, but I would guess, based on his imagery, it's something like a star body. And stars, for Paul, are real bodies up there. Mm-hmm. They are photonic bodies that last for a very long time, much longer than our human mortal bodies, which just grow old and decay. For us, that takes about 80 years. For people in the ancient world, you'd be lucky to live to 40. So that's as long as this body is going to last. And so this is really important, that it's really only the author of Acts, whom I think is 2nd century, who wants to make a firm break between Jesus's resurrection and the ascension, separating them by 40 days. That's an innovation, I think.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to move on to a couple other super chats.
Let me add one thing to that.
Okay.
To Pleroma, Doc Pleroma. I'm glad you mentioned 2 Corinthians 5, because you also have tentless or nakedness. So you're tentless, and then you get a permanent house. He switches his metaphors, but both are fine. And the other is you're clothed, and then you're naked and reclothed. But he says, you have to look at the last verses of chapter 4. We look to the things above, not the things below. For the things above are eternal, and the things below are temporal. So it really has to do with a mortal realm below. And as David said, as you go higher, it gets more ethereal. And finally, what you could call immortal, at least not immortal means not mortal, like not death, right? So you go up as you go. But he says the point is not to be naked, but to be further clothed. And so the naked state, I take it, is some sort of interim state, perhaps, before the parousia. And that's not your hope. So it's almost like he quotes a kind of Platonic sounding idea at the end of chapter 4. And then he says, but we don't just want that. Otherwise, hey, the bird out of the cage, you don't need the body. But he thinks you do need a body. You need a mode of existence in this new creation that he thinks is beginning to emerge.
And to put it point blank, though, he does not mean the literal, physical, absolute, same exact body that we have now, right?
Absolutely,
No,
but
you wouldn't survive in heaven with this body.
yeah,
Got it.
You couldn't.
I think in Mark, particularly if you take the proper ending, the verse 8 of chapter 16, Norman Perrin taught me this at Chicago, and I call Norman Perrin Mr. Mark. I really respect what he said. And he thinks that, and he's not the only one who said this, but he thought that the reason you don't have resurrection appearances is because Jesus has ascended. Now, there's resurrection as ascension. So if you want to read about Jesus being ascended or raised from the dead, I agree with Dave. It's the same thing. You would really go to the so-called transfiguration, probably the most misnamed thing in the New Testament, which is Mark 9, where they see this Moses and Elijah in this visionary state, and as if they're already passing into this upper realm and shining like the stars forever, to quote Daniel 12 and so forth. And then it poofs away, and everybody's like, whoa, what was that? And they're all excited because they think, yeah, that's what we want. Is that ahead? And he goes, actually, the cross is ahead. That's Mark's thing. Like, yeah, that was really a great thing, but we're not doing that now. We're gonna get nailed to crosses first. And so I think for Mark to have a physical appearances like eating fish and stuff like that, that would just totally destroy his understanding. And Luke and of course John only picks that up very, very late, and I think it is more of a second century thing. I think it's apologetic. It's because people were saying, well, how do you know you didn't see a ghost? Now, how would I know that's why? Because it's mentioned in the text.
Yeah, we didn't see a ghost.
We didn't see it. Yeah.
We only got 30 minutes left, or 33.
You go.
So
yeah.
Hell Awaits, thank you for the 20. I'm gonna ask the question anyway. It's an opinion, because really you can give your own thoughts. Great show as always. Was Paul gay? Now, Dr. Tabor and I have actually interviewed on this topic, at least the thorn in Paul's side. He gives his 2 cents on it. Rabbi Tovia Singer, of course, came on and said he thinks Paul was gay, or at least struggled with something like that. Let's start with David, since you had the final word, and then we'll flip back to you, Dr. Tabor.
Yeah, I can be brief because all of this is speculation, but I think there's a great... So if you think that Paul wasn't attracted to women, that's one thing. But if you're not, and he probably wasn't, if you're not attracted to women, though, there is a range of other things that you can be besides gay.
Right.
And I would put my money on something like asexual. I don't know, but I suspect that may be the case. And I do have more information on later second century Christians, like Julius Cassianus and some very ascetic, or sometimes called Encretite Christians, whom I think were basically asexual. They didn't feel attraction either way. But again, yeah, I think we would need a time machine to answer this one.
Right. Dr. Tabor?
And I agree. We just don't know. But I would lean more towards the idea that he's struggling with sexual temptation of some type. In Romans 7, when he says, the good that I would, I do not, and so forth. And even though it's translated coveting, in the old King James, and that passes into all the translations, it's something about the flesh. And I don't think it's like, oh, I have a bad temper, or I tend to lie a lot, or I don't know why I'm not a kinder person. I think he's really facing something. And he's trying to live a celibate life. He says that. And he says it's a gift that you get. But we know from all of the spiritual experiences of early Christianity, when people give this a try, it often just exasperates their dreams and visions and imaginations. You can't control your dreams, according to Freud. And so I picture him even, I suggested to you, as you know, that the thorn in the flesh, so-called, was in fact sexual temptation. and he wants to be away from the body, at home with the Lord. But while he's in the body, he's got this struggle. He's seen all of this glory, 2 Corinthians 10, which I wrote the book about. But he has to come back down to earth and face the flesh. But again, pure speculation. But I don't think I would think it's more likely that he's tempted by women, asexual, than that he's gay, because I don't know any evidence of that. And he's pretty hard on homosexual kinds of things in Romans 1 and 1 Corinthians 6, I guess, and so forth. I know it can be interpreted in a more open way, but
yeah,
he doesn't seem to draw many nuances. He just gets very worked up about it. Now, if you want to psychoanalyze Paul, you could say, why is he screaming and yelling in Romans 1 about these horrible, despicable, nasty, dirty things these people are doing? We've noticed in our own day and time that the preachers that rail most against such things turn out later to be facing some of their own temptations, right?
that's true.
So,
It's a guessing game. It's a guessing game.
It's a guessing game, yeah.
Yeah. Sobek, Lord of the Four Corners. He is also a patron of Dr. David Litwa. And thanks for being the patron and a friend of Myth Vision. So his question is, should we understand Paul's soteriology as apatheosis, as in, and he actually sent me an email to give me the meaning of these, Paul's ascent to paradise, PATP, or
I'm going to start
deification,
using that. I love it. Thank you.
or WABT, which is we are being transformed. Can you elaborate on these concepts? Which of these fits best within his cultural milieu?
Go ahead, David. You've written the most about apotheosis.
I really appreciate the question, Jason. I think that for me, apotheosis and deification are the same thing. Or at least I use them synonymously. So there's no worries there. And what deification means is quite literally becoming a deus, which is a god. And what's a god in the Greco-Roman world? You have to ask that question rather than what is a god today. What's a god in the Greco-Roman world? Well, a god in the Greco-Roman world is a being of deathless life, that is an immortal being, usually with superhuman power. And power can be conceived in very many ways. You could have great intelligence, great beauty, or some great strength, as we see in Heracles or Hercules. So both of those elements together shows you why it was very logical for, I think, a lot of people in the Greco-Roman world to very logically and rationally say that the Roman emperor was a god. He's referred to just with that simple word theos, God in Greek, in literally thousands of inscriptions. And they aren't just playing games or political games. Okay, they do think that on some level there is an immortal genius or genius to the emperor, and that the emperor obviously does demonstrate a kind of superhuman power. Sometimes they perform miracles. We've seen that in the case of Vespasian. So it is the case, I think, that you could rationally believe in the ancient world that a human being became a god or was a god, and also a god on earth. And there's nothing illogical or irrational about that. And Paul goes around the Greco-Roman world spreading a gospel, which is a political message of good news and beneficence, saying that, guess what, everybody, you can become immortal, just like the Roman emperor, or just like Heracles or Asclepius or Romulus. And you also can have superhuman power. How do you get superhuman power for Paul? Well, as we talked about earlier, judging angels, you get the cosmic power. When the cosmos is reformed, it's sort of like, it's sort of like, imagine an empire, right? An evil empire gets taken over, and then there's a rehashing and a total restructuring of who gets the political power.
Yeah.
So Christians are going to be the ones sort of, on Jesus's side, the new ruler's side, and so the Christians conceive of themselves as getting that extreme cosmic power, because when you're on the cosmic level, your political power is cosmic power. So all those evil angels and spirits who are running around now bothering Christians are going to get back at them and rule them when the cosmos is reformed, as it were. So Christians will have both immortal life, deathlessness, and supercosmic power, superhuman power. And that is why the Pauline message of salvation is a message of deification. And that is simply reading Paul in his Greco-Roman context.
So this is where I want to jump in. Totally agree. And go to Philippians 2. Because Philippians 2, we have this so-called hymn. It's usually seen as pre-Pauline. And many New Testament scholars or people that work on these texts are suggesting, this isn't my idea, Charles Talbert has one of the most earliest articles on this, is that it's not about a pre-existent divine being who gave up divinity, became a human, died on a cross, and then was highly exalted, sort of the round trip, like divine being comes down, shows the way, goes back up, and that would be an example of service and sacrifice. And I've become convinced by Talbert and others, James Dunn, others hold this view, the late James Dunn, Jimmy, my friend, that Paul has an Adam Christology here. So as soon as you hear it, it just clicks. Though he was in the form of God, Adam, made in the image of God, first Adam. So second Adam is a human being, and so he's mortal Adam, Adam of the flesh, so to speak. He did not consider equality with God as something to be grasped. What did Adam do in the Eden story? I want to grasp that fruit. And what does the Nakash say? I'm not going to call him the devil, but the Nakash, the shining one. He says, if you do that, you'll have knowledge of good and evil, and you'll be like God. So here we have a second Adam. He's an Adam. He's flesh and blood, Jesus. But he doesn't go that route to get equality with God. Instead, he empties himself, takes on the form of a servant, and finally dies on a cross. And therefore, God exalts him. This is Paul's servant theology. In other words, Philippians 2 is not about, it's about Jesus, but it's supposed to be a model for everybody. Like, you're destined to become equal with God. Do you not know the saints will judge the world? But how are you going to get that power? Mark is very influenced by Paul, and the whole book of Mark is about this. Don't seek glory, power. Don't put yourself first, right? Because then you're going to be last. But if you empty yourself and become a servant, or even a doulos, a slave, even stronger word, then you can be exalted. And so you think of all the passages in Paul, even Romans 8, which is his most glorified chapter, he says, provided that we suffer with him, that we may be glorified with him. So if you try to skip the suffering and grab that fruit like Adam and Eve did in the garden, you're just going to end up outside the gates of Eden, and you're going to die. Dust you are, to dust you will return.
Brian, thank you for the super chat. I understand the authentic letters of Paul were written by the same person, but how do we know that was in fact Paul?
Well, I guess, one of the things to keep in mind for scholarship in the humanities is that this is not science. This is not dealing with absolute truths and things that dogmatic points. Okay, so yes, all that we have in the manuscripts are letters that are signed or starting with Paulos, which is the Greek word for Paul. And all that scholars have done since the 19th century is to determine that, based on stylistic criteria, theology, and other factors, that 7 of these appear to be authentic, whereas the others, sometimes 5, sometimes 6, depending on how you gear things, the others are not authentic. So that's where we are, and that's all that we can pretend to know. But I think that, yeah, this isn't science. I mean, we just don't actually absolutely know for sure, but that's because we don't know anything for sure. But that doesn't mean that we can't still do scholarship based on the best of all hypotheses to move forward.
Well said. Or Scott Daniel, Paul uses morphe from form in Philippians 2. Is this the same term used for image of God in the Septuagint?
I think so. Yes.
It's so in morphe, is a bit different than icon. And icon is the word in Genesis 1:26. But I'll have to check. And this has been a while. But in Genesis 5, if I could just pull it up here. The phrase is katikana there as well too. So that means according to the image. But interestingly, when Adam gives birth to Seth, the Greek changes just a little bit to katatene deon. But as far as I can see, morphe is actually distinctive in Philippians 2. And so then the exegetical or linguistic question is, why use that term? And there's a good article on this by Steenberg, if you're able to look it up, on the distinctive use of morphe and whether that would have a different meaning than acon. They are generally viewed as synonyms, but there are definitely different nuances.
Thank you so much. And
I would like to ask David, because I think he would know much more about this than I do, to what degree in the East, we have Greek Orthodox theologians that talk about, why are you so excited about deification? Of course, that's absolutely what the church should be teaching. And Westerners seem to think it's idolatry almost, or something like that, you're going to become God. But in the fathers, the early fathers, so-called fathers, patriarchs, patristic fathers, would you say, David, that there's a general view that humans are going to become as God or as Christ? And it certainly seems to be hinted at in Paul. He's the first of many. And when and how did it become so strange to people that that's the redemptive plan, is to redeem humanity into a deified state?
Well, that's really important. And it's a question I get into in Becoming Divine, because actually, I mean, Luther has a doctrine of deification. So that's something that, for some reason has really been lost. And I deal actually with the Mormons, because I think I give credit to the Mormons for actually bringing back a lot of, or Joseph Smith specifically for bringing back some of the ancient discourse. But just very, very quickly, because we don't have much time, one of the ways you can control your research, like a lot of scholars, they get criticized for being too speculative or over speculative, and we're not dealing with scientific disciplines, but we do need controls for our research. So someone could legitimately ask me or you or anyone who wants to propose that Paul was talking about deification, well, does anyone in the ancient world say that Paul's ascent to heaven was a deification? And actually the answer is yes. The very first person to say that is not a patristic author, but the Nicene preacher, and Nicenes, I've given a show with Neil in Gnostic Informant about this, but the Nicene preacher is I think an Alexandrian, late 2nd century, and he directly says that Paul became a god when he ascended to the third heaven, and that that Jesus essentially goes through the same thing, because that's what ascension is. Ascension is deification, because it requires you to have to go into a different ecology and to have a body, a soma pneumaticon, a spirit body that can survive as an immortal spirit being in those higher heavenly echelons. So that we do have attested that is also what ancients thought, and that comes from the Nicene preacher. Now, interestingly, when you deal with the Orthodox tradition, and this goes back to, Epistle to Diognetus, it goes back to Clement, it goes back to Augustine. All these people are saying that the truth of salvation is deification. Okay, and they're using words theopoiesis, that just means God making, right? So they know what this means, and this is what they preach. But the problem is, and the reason why even I would disagree with modern Greek or what have you, Russian Orthodoxy, is that beginning in the 3rd and 4th century, you have an absolute ontological divide generated in Christian theology. Part of the developments that went into the Nicene Creed in determining why Jesus is a special deified person, right? Because, of course, Christians, by the 4th century, the Orthodox camp, they really want to make Jesus special for obvious reasons. And if you begin saying that we're all becoming gods, that it's a mass deification, then in the Orthodox tradition, Jesus doesn't become special enough, right? And so when I was in an interview once, and a very conservative Catholic dean asked me, well, you wrote a book on Jesus Deus, the early Christian depiction of Jesus as a Mediterranean God. Don't you mean the Mediterranean God? And I said, no, absolutely not. But this impulse, this Christian impulse to make Jesus special, right, as a deified person, to some extent, Christians agree and have to agree that Jesus is a deified person, but he's become so special. And certainly by the late 4th century, when he is fully integrated into the Godhead, and the Godhead is fully ontologically, hermetically sealed off from the world, then when the Orthodox people talk about deification, they don't really mean becoming God, even though that's what the language says, right? They mean you become a spirit being,
immortal, powerful, yeah.
But you are as far away from God ontologically as a piece of grass is as far away from God ontologically. You may even be in the image of God, but ontologically, you'll never cross what I call the iron ceiling. And what's really important to keep in mind is that in Paul's day, which again is hundreds of years before Orthodoxy, those ontological barriers, that philosophical version of Christianity, which Orthodoxy developed, did not yet exist. So that's why studying the earliest part of Christianity, I think, is very fun and rewarding for me. And it's very important for everyone here to understand that, not to be anachronistic. And even if you see, in Greek Orthodoxy and in some Roman Catholic traditions that they say, oh yeah, well, Augustine believes in deification, but Augustine also believes that we are made of nothing, and that we will never cross the ontological gap into real godhood. So be very careful that there is a linguistic overlap, but in terms of the philosophical meaning, they are miles and miles away from Paul.
Very well said. Yeah. And, Athanasius asked Arius, was there a time when he was not? And that gets right to it. Reincarnation is a pretty common theme in many traditions in the Hellenistic world, but the notion is if there was a time, if Jesus is a created being, or Christ, the Logos, and there was a time when he was not, then you've broken the barrier. But if the answer is no, then you're with Nicaea. And of course, we have Arians today. I guess the Jehovah's Witnesses might be called Arian, and others that certainly the Ebionites, from what we can tell, seem to go in that direction. But yeah, I'm really glad you pointed that out. You know, I taught at Notre Dame, and David Bentley Hart is there now, but David always likes to point out, he's seen interviews with Robert Kuhn on Closer to Truth and so forth, because Robert likes to explore these things it's all on YouTube now, but it used to be PBS. And he always points this out, and I always want to ask him exactly what you just said. You know, I'm just listening and I'm thinking, well, because he's a good translator of the New Testament, and he really does work on the language. But, you know, just to say, oh, in the East they believe in deification can be very misleading, you know, as a corrective to, say, the modern West. I'm glad you mentioned Luther, too, because lots of times we assume that Luther would be sort of like a 19th century evangelical Christian. And Luther was pretty classically trained in Christian theology. So,
yeah, I mean, he knew medieval theology. That was his bread and butter as
that's
a
right.
monk and a theology student.
So he's not going to make that stupid mistake of thinking, oh, they mentioned you could become God, or he became like us, so we could become like him. Well, what do you mean like him?
Yeah, there's a lot of fudging on that term like. Yeah, people like to use that word like or as, like God or as God, because in terms of that word like, that's only 4 letters, but it has an infinite ability to stretch its meaning. And so, the fudge factor here is incredible.
Sort of like
what
the
I
word
mean by
until.
deification.
Yeah.
Well, so I mean, someone to sound pious could say, oh, well, I believe we can become like God, so that's deification, right? Well, I mean, on the most watered down level possible, because you're still trying to fit into an Orthodox tradition. But really what deification means, not just etymologically, but I think in Paul's day, is it does mean becoming a God. And if your theology has changed so that God is now this inaccessible, ontologically distant, you know, immovable, Platonic entity, well, then farewell to deification. But that's not what Christianity started with. And that's really important to know.
Very good.
I had one more on the email sent by Jojo Freelancer. How did Jesus go to heaven? If the earth is round, did he walk in another dimension? He went with a physical body to God's right hand. Is God physical too? Does Yahweh have 2 natures? And Muslims worship God. And if Jesus is half God, are the Muslims saved too, according to Christianity? There's a lot there. But you have to answer it in 30 seconds. No,
that's an hour and a half program in a couple of weeks, maybe.
Yeah, call us back for that one. Just a very short note answer. Yes, they believe the earth is round. Okay, they're not flat earthers in the ancient world. Yes, you do rise in a physical body, but it's not this body. It's more like a star or astral or ethereal body. Yes, I mean, that does make you divine, and you're not half divine. You're fully divine. As for me, as long as you're an immortal being with superhuman cosmic power, you've graduated into the category of God. So there you go.
He said, "Is God physical?"
I think the terms material, spiritual, all of our assumptions about them, even in science today, you know, it's like we just conveniently forget Einstein with our famous little formula we learned in 8th grade about E equals mc squared. And we just talk, you know, about metaphysics and physics and the material world and the spiritual world, as if those are the categories that you're going to have in these Hellenistic texts. And as David already mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15, you can have a pneumikos body, you know, soma, but what does that mean? You know, is it like an air hose puffing around, or it's just assuming a physics that is not really the physics that people imagine in their language.
Thank you so much. I wanted to jab one more, just a jab. This is a jab by Ken McCracken. Christ is God over all, blessed forever, according to Paul in Romans, not created.
Well, again, translation. That's the same verse we talked about before.
Textual problems too.
And textual problems.
The grammar is disputed in Romans 9:5. So you should go back to the Greek there, Ken, and work that out very carefully and check the commentaries. Yeah.
Check the Hermenia or the Anchor Bible, particularly, because they would, and then tons of articles. If you look at JSTOR and do a search for, even the verse, you'll get unbelievable amounts of material.
Keep it up, gentlemen. Thank you so much for the time. Go check out the blog, of course. This one right here.
Just for further information. Yeah, it goes beyond Amazon, basically.
Yeah. If you want to
that's
check
good.
out a little more detail, figuring out what the books are about, please go check him out in the description. He has the Patreon. He's offering Deification. Seriously, though, there's a lot he offers. And, of course, you have a couple books on your Patreon that you, literally they can access. They're technically what you would go to Amazon to buy a book. How much is that book?
Yeah, if you want to save $136 on We Are Being Transformed, you can just join my Patreon, and I will give it to you for free.
How about that?